Hello and welcome back to Movie Recap Time. Today, we will be recapping a 2017 science fiction horror movie, titled Life. But before we start, if you enjoy our recaps, please subscribe as it helps us enormously. Enjoy! An unmanned space probe returned from Mars to Earth. The capsule was to be captured by the International Space Station. Miranda North reported that Rory would be sent to capture the Mars capsule from outside the space station. Rory's mission was successful, and they connected the capsule to the space station. Hugh examined the capsule while the other astronauts stayed outside the lab to watch. They realized the cell was not growing in the current atmosphere. After many attempts from Hugh, he changed the atmosphere by adding some glucose to the cell, and he was able to wake up the dormant cell. After the great success, they were granted an interview with an American school. The kids asked a lot of questions, like how do they urinate in space, don't their parents miss them, and a lot more. They told the kids about the cell. The pupils of the school named the cell they had found, Calvin. North asked David why he hadn't left the space station in over 400 days. David replied to her that while he was on Earth, he was stationed in Syria during the war. They would go, treat the war victims, and in about a week, the whole community would be destroyed. David didn't like the toxic nature of the Earth, so that's why he refused to go back. North advised him that not everywhere on Earth is Syria, and there is nowhere like home. That night, North also appreciated Hugh for their success on Calvin. The following day, Hugh entered the lab to complete experiments on Calvin. He noticed that every cell in Calvin is a microcell. They could change their specialization, and every cell could act in each other's duties. Hugh said Calvin had developed the means to interact with his environment, including the means of proto-appendages. Hugh wanted to demonstrate what he was explaining. Calvin approached as Hugh held his hands nearer to Calvin. North commented that the cell kept approaching and not retreating. Hugh thinks it was because of curiosity. That night, Sho, one of the crew members, watched his wife in labor on a video call. After the successful labor, Sher's wife gave birth to a child May. Sho showed everyone in the space station his child. They were happy for him. As a daily duty, Hugh visited Calvin the next day in the lab to play with him. Suddenly, a red alert sounded from the lab. As David went to control it, Hugh said the reason for the alert was a clamp that he had mistakenly forgotten about. Rory got angry. He told Hugh he had become obsessed with the cell. He should stop calling the cell Calvin, as they do not know precisely what it was. In North reports, she said that weeks after Hugh's mistake with the clamp, Calvin had gone into a long sleep, and he was no longer alive. She said Hugh was very depressed over the cell, and he had become a shadow of himself. Well for her, she thinks it was a good thing the cell got disabled because she now had time to work on the security of the space station. One night when she was treating Hugh's legs, Hugh asked North for permission to stimulate Calvin with electricity. She claimed she didn't have the power to give such authorization, but Hugh convinced her. Hugh believed Calvin could be used for stem cell research to grow the irreparable cells in the human body just like his legs. After persuading North for a while, she allowed Hugh to enter the lab with an electronic probe. As he used the instrument on Calvin, Calvin woke up and destroyed the device, thereby sticking to Hugh's hands forcefully. Hugh tried to distract Calvin but he was determined. Calvin entered Hugh's glove, violently attacked Hugh's hands and broke his hand. After breaking Hugh's hands, he entered his lab by cutting the glove with the probe. The other crew was arguing. Hugh was in pain, and they didn't know how to help him. Rory asked North to enter and save Hugh, but North refused as if they went in, Calvin could escape. With Calvin gaining access outside its enclosed lab, they knew Hugh was no longer safe in the lab. Calvin first went to the test mouse, entered the mouse, and came out. While Calvin was distracted, David entered the lab to drag Hugh out. As he dragged Hugh, Calvin stuck to his legs so that he couldn't leave the lab. Rory asked for permission to kill Calvin, and North permitted him. Sho asked him to generate fire and burn Calvin, although they would soon run out of fuel. Angrily, Rory opened fire on Calvin, who in return kept running and dodging from the fire. He was so fast. When the fuel ran out, Calvin jumped into Rory's mouth and killed Rory. The incinerator Rory was holding was thrown into the lab, causing a fire outbreak. When Calvin came out of Rory, he was a lot bigger. He tried to escape from the lab through the airlock. There was no way they could close down the airlock altogether, so they closed one after another. Unfortunately for the crew, Calvin escaped. Kat asked to communicate with Earth. Sho scheduled the distress call, but the call broke at a stage. They had lost all communications to Earth. Kat needed to go outside and check the problem with the communication vault so they could re-establish communications to Earth. When she got there, she opened the vault, and Calvin jumped out, this time around much bigger. They were all shocked as to how Calvin could survive that much. Calvin jumped at Kat since he couldn't enter her suit. He ruptured her cooler system, thereby filling her suit with cooling fluid. She jumped to safety. David waited for her at the airlock and urged her to open the door, but she knew Calvin was stuck on her body and felt it would pose a danger to her other teammate. If Calvin was allowed inside, she stayed outside and drowned. Calvin lets go of her after she drowns. The crew had already lost 2 members. They were down. Hugh advised them Calvin won't survive for so long. North asked if there were any other means Calvin could enter the spaceship. Through the thruster. They all watched 6 thrusters to know which one Calvin would attempt to gain entrance from. As he came near a thruster, the sensors alerted them, triggering the thruster. Over time they lost a lot of fuel and were already out of orbit around the Earth. If Sho uses the remaining fuel to bring them back into orbit, then Calvin will gain entrance to the space station. But if he doesn't use the fuel, they will fall to Earth, thereby Calvin will also fall to Earth, and he might survive. When North heard of the 2 options, she said if it were either them or the Earth, then they would die. Sho used the fuel to get them back into orbit, and Calvin gained entrance. Hugh suggested that the only reason the cells didn't grow on the Mars was lack of air, so if they restricted the air, Calvin might die. They locked up the airways and planned to trap Calvin in a capsule without air. That night Hugh mourned the death of Rory. He said it was his fault. While North said it should be their fault as they all allowed it to happen, David insisted it was his fault for bringing the capsule in. Hugh insisted that Calvin doesn't hate them, he just wants to survive just like humans do. Suddenly, Hugh collapsed. They tried to resuscitate him to no avail. They removed his trousers and saw that Calvin had stuck to his legs while they were closing the airways, and since Hugh is disabled, he didn't feel it. Calvin had been feeding off his legs and killed him. Calvin chased the other crew members. Sho sealed himself to the sleeping pod, and Calvin tried to gain entrance. North and David distracted Calvin with Hugh's dead body to allow Sho to survive. Sho looked at a photo of his daughter in the sleeping pod and said he would see her soon. David and North saw that Calvin had swallowed Hugh's tracker so he could now be traced. They sealed him off in a compartment. The space station sounded a proximity alert. After getting Kat's distress call, Earth sent a spacecraft. It was to dock in the same compartment they had sealed Calvin in. They tried to warn them to no avail. David was happy they would be saved, but North told him the real reason the capsule was sent from Earth. She told him the spacecraft was a failsafe and wasn't coming to save them but to push the space station into deep space, as that was the protocol she developed. They would rather risk their lives than let Calvin get to Earth. When Sho saw the station coming, he thought it was to save them, so he left the sleeping pod to go towards the station. However, Calvin followed Sho to the capsule and killed everyone. Sho sacrifices himself to trap Calvin in the spacecraft, but it is unsuccessful. The spacecraft detaches and crashes on the space station, causing them to lose orbit again. There was no fuel to pilot the station down to safety again, and they had about 30 minutes left. The survivors, David and North, thought about the memories they had on Earth. They both talked about their father and how he read stories to them. North commented that she missed her father, and they both said words that felt like farewell speeches. They feared Calvin might enter Earth. David thought of a plan. Calvin could not survive without oxygen and there were 2 lifeboats in the space station. David agreed to lower Calvin into boat A, manually pilot it into deep space and isolate it there while North pilot the boat B and go back to Earth. North refused. She said it had all been her plan so she should be the one to die, but David insisted otherwise. David insisted he belonged to the sky. North agreed. As planned, David uses an oxygen candle to trap Calvin into his pod, and North gives him manual access to pilot the pod. In North's final note, she wrote that the creature killed 4 of her crew members, including David, who would be the 5th. She warned that the Mars creatures are deadly. They can't be contained, so they should be killed if the creature finds its way to reach Earth. Calvin stuck to David's hands while piloting, and David lost control. They then crashed into each other's pods. One of the pods reached the Earth. It fell right in front of some fishermen. It was David's pod, while North's pod, unfortunately, fell into deep space. The fisherman who saw David's pod came over to investigate and opened it despite David's warning. The movie ended of. Thank you for watching the recap. Please remember to subscribe to our channel so you will get notified when we post the next recap. If you enjoyed the recap, we will have a link to buy this movie in the description. See you next time.